Hello and welcome to Newslaundry interviews. Today we have with us Shehzad Ghias Shaikh, a Fulbright scholar, a lawyer by training, and a stand-up comic from Pakistan. He's based out of Karachi. Shehzad also hosts the popular podcast, The Pakistan Experience, a podcast I highly recommend for its honest and humorous take on all that plagues Pakistani society. What has prompted the people of Pakistan to come out in such large numbers? I believe there's been protests in Karachi, in Gujranwala. People are really coming out on the streets. What's prompting them to do that?
It's the suddenness, it's the absolute suddenness of the civil war that has erupted in Pakistan. It's only when I saw Indian news channels that I discovered that there's a civil war happening in Karachi. I was quite taken aback by finding out about my own civil war through, through Republic TV. When I went out, everything was open. Yes, because of COVID, there is massive inflation. The economy is not as great as maybe it was pre-COVID. So there is resentment towards the government. Imran Khan came to power on the back of the Tabdili Nara, which was the change narrative that we want to cause some change. It's been 2 years, and it's the right of the people to ask, where is the change you promised? So there is that resentment.
What are the incentives for the opposition parties to come out and sort of orchestrate this protest movement? What are they looking at? And specifically, Nawaz Sharif has criticized the Pakistani army. He's named the general, he's named the ISI chief. And this is sort of making a lot of waves across news networks and I'm sure in Pakistan and elsewhere. How, first question, what are the incentives? And second question is, how does Nawaz Sharif get the balls to do that?
With Nawaz Sharif, he was ousted from the government, and he's been really pushed into the corner. And it's sort of become personal between him and Imran Khan. If you look at the history of almost all of our leaders, they were all selected by the deep state. The deep state is active in the politics. The military establishment is active in the politics. There is no denying that. Nawaz Sharif has had his issues with Musharraf. He's had his issues when he was in government. He has gone balls out on this. So my theory that they just want a stronger negotiating table, I was convinced of that 100%. But after listening to Nawaz Sharif, maybe I'm at 80%. Because with Nawaz Sharif in particular,
Is political instability baked into the Pakistan cake? And here I want to reference to your conversation with Professor Ishtiaq Ahmed on your podcast, where the two of you were discussing the role of Jinnah in the creation of Pakistan. So explore this subject for me a bit. Political instability in Pakistan and the creation of the Pakistani state itself.
because everything happened so suddenly, I think people did not anticipate the British to leave so quickly. Uh, the boundaries were drawn up almost overnight, seemingly, to the extent that post partition, a lot of towns did not know whether they were India or Pakistan. And the idea of Pakistan was not fully fleshed out, I would say. I think a lot of that was, again, political in terms of the two nation theory. I don't think it took stead in every single town. Whereas normally any political idea, well, now you have social media, but historically you'd have to go town to sell that idea. Even with the Emancipation Proclamation, Lincoln sat in a car, went out, gave those speeches, and said, "We now need to abolish slavery because da 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 da." I think with the idea of Pakistan, a lot of that was, let's switch uh, the power from the British to the Muslim League without necessarily going to every single town and having that buy-in. Every single person did not have the buy-in that they needed to be a part of Pakistan. I think colonialism actually is the most underrated problem that this region has had, and we've sort of forgotten the original sin. We we lay a lot of these claims at the footsteps of our political leaders without ever really questioning the colonial legacy that made them who they are. I think the hangover of colonialism, we never really got over. We simply switched the skin color of our leaders, but we did not really question the fundamental systems. Especially in Pakistan, the colonial systems that were set, we did not really question. So once the government came to power, they wanted to rule in the stead of colonial leaders without really trying to change that system. So a lot of people, life did not change for them. So in terms of the binding force, they were just told that now that Pakistan has been created, you're still doing what you were doing under the British, but you're doing it for us. A lot of people were still enslaved, whether that be economic, whether that be through landlords, whether that be through disenfranchisement, whether that be through ethnicity.
Do you see any signs of a pushback from the locals or vis-a-vis their masters, quote unquote? I mean, do you see a pushback? Do you see a reaffirmation of Pakistani, or Pakistani and the multiple Pakistani identities that exist? Do you see anybody or any political party today asserting that in a positive way and not necessarily in a regressive way? I would make that distinction, because there is a tendency to be revisionist. So I'm not saying is anybody being revisionist, but is anybody challenging the Anglophiles that continue to dominate the state of Pakistan?
So during Game of Thrones, there's a great quote where Littlefinger goes to Cersei and says, "Knowledge is power, chaos is a ladder." And then Cersei orders her guards to point the swords at Littlefinger and says, "Power is power." So a lot of times there has been movements, there have been people who try to reassert their identity or take pride in that identity, and then they go missing. Then you have no idea where they are, because power is power. What you're going up against is power. What you're going up against is people's economic interests that have been protected and systems that have been perpetuated for decades. They're too powerful for an alternate narrative to really take stead. That being said, there are grassroots movements.
You began with the now famous words of the suddenness of the move. And I actually had a question which I was contemplating if I should ask or not, but since you began with that, I will ask you. I was, when the protest started in Pakistan, I happened to sort of around that time come across your podcast. Then I started following you on Twitter. And on Twitter, you mentioned that look at the Indian media. They are calling a civil war in Karachi where none exists. So that was the limited point that you made. And you obviously, because you're a comic, you did it in a funny way rather than a dull way. So my question to you here is that, when somebody as credible as you, somebody who's as honest as you, when you bring up the India angle where none really is needed, are you sort of doing a disservice to your society? And I say that because the general perception is that the power that you mentioned in Game of Thrones, the army in Pakistan tends to get its power by creating a fear psychosis within Pakistan about a potential threat from India. That potential threat could or could not exist. I don't want to go into that. But when you sort of take on Indian media coverage and then comment on that, aren't you doing a disservice by bringing in India where India is not needed?
We cannot deny the fact that Pakistan has this obsession with India because India is a lot bigger. What happens in Pakistan is impacted, whether directly or indirectly, by what happens in India, whereas maybe what happens in India is not that impacted by what happens in Pakistan. Yes, there's certain media organizations in both our countries which are fear mongering, which benefit, whether directly, whether they're supported by the deep state or the ruling parties to do what they do, or they're just doing it for the ratings without really realizing the long-term repercussions of what they're doing. It's either. I don't know which one is better than the other. So there is that element in both of our medias which should not be taken that seriously. And it needs to be shown to people in this era of fake news. I think a lot of times you don't even know what to believe. A broken clock is also right 2 times in a day. So I did want to mock certain media channels in India, calling it a civil war by posting a picture of the Avengers Civil War and saying just went to Karachi airport and this is what I saw, to show people in India who might be looking at credible voices in Pakistan to say what is truly going on. Because what we are being shown, and it's not even, it's beyond fake news now. It's beyond fake news. The video that they were showing as evidence of the army being attacked by people was completely fake. It just did not exist.
How brave do you have to be to do political satire in Pakistan? And what's the scene like?
I think in terms of stand-up comedy, we don't really have an industry. We don't really have a scene. It's very individualistic. Everybody is doing what they're doing. If we go into the history of that, that's a much longer podcast. North India, especially the Punjab region, has had a history of performances called bhands, who were wandering comedians who relied a lot on improvisation. And what people miss out on when you see a show like Comedy Night with Kapil, or you see a show like Khabarnak on TV, which tries to replicate the form without really the philosophy of the form. A lot of the bhand jokes, which are similar to carnivalesque historically, are based on social inversion. It's based on that Shakespearean idea of the fool saying the smart thing to King Lear. King Lear cannot even stand his daughter saying she does not love him, and would banish the daughter that he loves the most, but would allow the fool to call him a fool, would allow the fool to mock him in court, and the fool can get away with a lot more.
मुफ्त खोरो मुफ्त में इतना ही मिलेगा. To watch the full unedited interview, you have to subscribe to News Laundry and pay to keep news free. Because when the public pays, the public is served. We depend on you and not on advertisers. So go to www.newslaundry.com/subscription and subscribe and get all our unedited interviews, our special video shows, comics, and everything that's behind the paywall. Remember, to subscribe to News Laundry, you pay just about 10 rupees a day. That's less than, well, no, a cigarette. And smoking is injurious to health. So subscribe and watch the full interview.